Hello there, and welcome to yet another video here. This time I would like to talk about the Primordial Tarot. It's a mass market deck, so it's easily available. This is a deck that I really appreciate. I just don't see it very much in other people's channels. It's easily available. It's a mass market deck. It's a reprint of an older deck called Tarot of the Origins. Maybe the reason why this deck isn't shown very much on people's channels is because it's a mass market deck, and we all know that our little world tilts more towards kind of boasting about indie decks. And I think another reason might be is because this is a deck that... Oh, how fierce she is. This is a deck that is kind of a system of its own. This is not an RWS deck. This is not a Thoth deck. This deck is actually quite difficult to pin down. The title Primordial Tarot is, I think, really appropriate because it is a deck that contains, I would say, considerable depth. It's very impactful. It's very visually, I would say, maybe even triggering for some people. It depicts this world of our early ancestors, so when civilization was not in sight just yet. In that sense, it's a world that kind of exists before human psychology, if that makes sense. It also has its own, almost all of the majors have been renamed. This is the Fool. Almost all of the majors have been renamed, and the deck follows its own numerological system, so it's really not easy to pin down. Although, in my experience, if you actually just follow the imagery, you will get quite a lot from it. The deck is published by Scarabeo. It's a really decently done, like they really do publish decks that are good quality, and I like their cardstock and their packaging, all of it. So it comes with this booklet where, of course, only a small portion is in English, like maybe the first, let me see. Okay, so the first 50 pages. The booklet was written by Barbara Moore, and I can't say that I'm really in love with it, the booklet. It's informative and useful, and basically the only way to learn its specific suits, because the suits are soul, blood, jewels, nature, that's how they're called. And then each of the numbers has its own name, so it has a very particular numerology. Aces are called etchings, twos are called ages, threes are masks, bones, stones, and so on. So this is handy, although I find that either she didn't have enough space, or this deck maybe went above her head a little bit for the time that she had to write this, because it doesn't really do justice, I think, to the images. I ordered this deck when I saw the box. I don't know even where I saw it. I ordered it on the late book depository. I just saw this image, and it was so raw and so intense that it's a bit glossy, so hopefully this doesn't bother you. When I saw this image, I thought, I don't know what the rest of them look like, but I sure as hell know I need this. So I just ordered the deck, knowing absolutely nothing about it. In the meantime, I now have the Tarot of the Origins, the early 2000s edition. I have the initial edition of Majors Only. That's out of print, so I've grown to really like and appreciate this deck. This is actually the second copy of this deck because I use it very frequently. So I would like to flip through the majors to show you what is it that I love about them. So for one, here in the Fool, we see an interesting conundrum here. So we see this person, and then there's an egg here. Considering that the Fool is 0 and that it's a card that kind of contains everything or nothing. It's a card that goes everywhere else. We may wonder if this is the Fool or if this is the Fool, the egg that's slowly hatching. And depending on the context of the reading, you can interpret this as awareness that is just being brought into the world, or you can focus on the figure, or you can just look at the whole image and just kind of see how bizarre it is. It actually depicts this, I don't even know if this kind of genderless, ambiguous figure holding a freaking egg on their head. So there's this element of absurd and bizarre even, which is something that we see with fools that are not Rider-Waite-Smith fools. For example, almost any Marseille fool, and especially the Noble fool, shows a crazy homeless person that walks around half naked with their penis out. So in that sense, this is not sexually explicit as imagery, but it does depict this bizarre, unhinged nature of the fool. So it's not your happy-go-lucky person going out there to conquer the world. It's very raw. It's kind of primal. This is not a person that goes out there to explore the world. They kind of erratically exist in it. You know, you can even say that this person is very happy that they have a head on their head. It just makes no sense, and to me that's the part of the charm. It's really nice how he used the composition here to convey that aspect of the fool, that it's someone that exists outside of conventions and social order. And also, if you see the egg as potential, the egg is still on the head, not inside the head, so it's someone who is really not realizing their potential just yet. There's really quite a bit contained in the card, and the image itself is really powerful. Then we have the magician, and here you see a magician with his hands up, or her hands up. It's one of the nice things about this deck is that sometimes you can't really tell the gender of these people. Holding their hands up towards the sun, performing some kind of a ritual. So this once again goes back to the setting of this deck. This is not a sophisticated magician who practices high magic. This is maybe not even someone who would call themselves a magician. This is just someone who performs acts of magic in the simplest of ways. It's raw, it's unsophisticated, unfiltered. It's just someone reaching for the skies, asking to get something. So you can still easily interpret this as you would any other magician, except you have to keep in mind that this is not someone who studies sophisticated correspondences. It's someone performing a ritual because it works, and not because they necessarily know why it works or what it works. It's kind of blind faith kind of a magician. So instead of the High Priestess, we have the Great Mother. I always find this image to be so powerful. In that little sample reading that I posted, this card came up, and I interpreted myself as this person here. So the Great Mother is not exactly the same as the High Priestess, because once again, we're not dealing with a world where there are any temples. This is the very dawn of mankind. She's disproportionately larger than this other figure, and she's wearing the chastity belt of some kind. So this perhaps tells us something if we're being very Freudian, and Barbara Moore, I think, was very Freudian in her interpretation of it. It says that even though you may desire to reconnect with where you came from, the door is closed. So in a very kind of literal way, there's no going back up. But at the same time, she stands above him and looks down on this person, or looks after this person. So you can say that this illustrates a kind of protection that divinity gives, a kind of connection to the greater universe. But definitely a sense of safety, sense of being looked after. And of course, if you see even her body is disappearing into the surrounding universe, you can maybe even make the case that she represents, given all the symbolism here, that she represents even some features of the classical high priestess from the RWS, kind of intuition. So the third one is actually called the Mother instead of the Empress. And then the Emperor, instead of the Emperor, we have the Father here. And it depicts this woman who made a clay figurine. So this Empress is about creation. It's about bringing something to life, giving shape to something. At the same time, it also depicts a ritual which exists in various magical traditions and is very, very old, where you create a figurine and then use your breath to give it life. So if you're reading something magical, this is also something that concerns magic in some way. This may invite you to do that as well. It's a rather brutal image, but really beautiful. So it's not a compassionate mother, but it is the giver of life. So this is the Father. So here we see someone who has a bone that they turned into some kind of a tool, looking into the future. So it's someone who looks after their family or their pack or whatever our ancestors lived in, and who thinks, you can see that by the kind of frowning forehead, who worries about things like food and territory and defense. So it's not that different from the traditional emperor, only perhaps has different concerns. So here we have number 5, the shaman. So the shaman here holds a hagstone. And once again, we have to kind of adjust. I don't know why he's being so blurry suddenly. There. So he has a hagstone that he uses, and he looks upward and towards the future. So we see a figure that shows the way forward, a figure that protects from evil. But at the same time, he's not your sophisticated pope wearing fancy robes, sitting on a throne. So this is a person that walks the earth like everyone else. So his face is, and you can see that he's been through a lot. And his eyes are slightly bloody, as you can see. So this is a shaman who's not afraid to get his hands dirty. A kind of warrior priest at the same time. So this is not talking about ethics or moral rules or even the nature of divinity. He's not a representative of any social structure, because shamanism isn't exactly organized as the Catholic Church. This is someone who is here to ward off evil and help take care of the people using magical means. In a sense, similar to the Emperor, only in different domains. Here we have number 6, union. This card is fairly easy to interpret, so I don't think there's the need for me to say much. You have two people tied together with the same necklace made of rocks and bones. This is the Chariot. I quite like it. First of all, because you have the illustration of a chariot here. So it talks about kind of what a chariot would talk about movement forward. So it's about needing progress. But the very fact that this chariot is etched into the stone tells you that it's about our desire to make lasting impact, for something to remain once we're gone. It's about moving things to the next level. It's also about accumulating knowledge, because etchings are also a way to communicate, preserve. Then we have number 8 here. This card is called Abundance, and it illustrates a hunter. This is what I mean when I say that this deck can be very confronting or even triggering. I mean, this is a bit of a violent card. It illustrates a hunter disemboweling whatever it is that they caught and cutting off pieces of meat. Let me see if you can... So this is a bit chipped and damaged from use, but see, he's very happy, looking presumably towards the rest of his group, because he provided quite a bit of sustenance to them. And this card may seem a little confronting, but in the context of the world in which this is situated, I think it also talks about a kind of natural balance. Because if the artist hadn't chosen to depict a person, he could have just as easily chosen another animal, killing and eating another animal. So this was not the time when people wore fur to make fashion statements. This was about survival. So in that sense, it is abundance, because there's a lot that he caught. But it's not about whether it's ethical to hunt or not. And this is the Hermit, one of the handful of cards that don't have their name changed. And we see the Hermit here, hiding inside this gigantic skull, moving away from others to seek wisdom and peace and stillness. I think there is something to be said also about the fact that he's hiding inside this huge skull. This is maybe seeking to have something akin to an intellectual understanding of the world, because he lives inside the skull, the brain. He lives in this eye socket, and it's elevated so he can see clearly. And so this is what I meant when I said that this deck, even with all the deficiencies of the little white book, lends itself to really lovely interpretation once you see the images for what they are and you're not just swayed by their raw power. So this is the Time card. So it's like Wheel of Fortune, but it's called Time. So we have here some ancient divine entity moving time, and you see here the time isn't exactly linear, but it kind of also shows why we would see it as linear, considering there were just bits and pieces here, kind of like the way we see the earth being flat, because we're too small to see the bigger picture. So this is Creative Power, card 11. So this is where you would normally have strength or justice, depending on which system you use. And here it's Creative Power. And we see a pregnant woman looking towards the past and wearing some kind of a dead animal here. So this talks obviously about creation, just the name itself, Creative Power, says that. But the creation has to do with her pregnancy. So it's not that kind of creation that leads to destruction and vice versa. It's about pure creation, just bringing something new into the world without having to destroy anything old. It's also in the kind of ladder, among the ladder arcanas, so it's a slight elevation towards humanity and civilization. So it's about emphasizing creation, but not at the cost of destruction. This is a stunning card. It's so simple and so effective. It's called The Sacrifice, and it illustrates a ritual where one sacrifices oneself. So it's not about literal murder, it's just about surrendering your sense of self. Something that I think this whole deck really does wonderfully well. A lot of tarot is about kind of endlessly exploring and venerating the self, which is a practice that I have to say irks me the wrong way. It's really nuisance, and it's a nuisance, truly. I don't think we need more building up of the self. I think we need more of the destruction of the self. We need to take ourselves less seriously, and instead we need to learn to connect with others, I would say. And this illustrates just that. It's a kind of spiritual death, right? It's surrender. But it's not loss, it's freedom. Considering that this is number 12, in traditional decks this would correspond to the Hanged Man, and I find this to be a much better, more refreshing interpretation. Because the Hanged Man is hanged because he's a traitor. So he's someone who is giving up his life for something larger than him, something that he believes in, but something that, whatever mainstream that he lives in doesn't believe in. And here we have someone willingly surrendering their self. So what this shares in common with the Hanged Man is this sense of a higher purpose, something that's worth sacrificing the self for. And then at the same time, there's also this sense of immobility, because look at this giant arrow facing the person. And then what's not present and obvious on the Hanged Man is here, and that is a sense of freedom, I guess you can say. Look at how he's spreading his arms. He's kind of welcoming this arrow. And then this is the Death card. It's called Death. It's really not very difficult to interpret what it is. We have a rhinoceros impaling a human. I guess if you were being psychological, you can say that we have an animal tying up and killing a tied up human. So you can make the case that this is your id. All the suppressed stuff that ends up killing you when it's not worked through. But if you don't favor such an interpretation, you can simply see this as the end, or death. It's also, I think, important to note that his hands are tied and his feet are tied as well. So it tells you that this is not one of those death means growth things. This is one of those things where something comes and kills you and there's nothing you can do about it whatsoever. This card is called the Source. So this would traditionally be the Temperance. And here it's called the Source. I think it also has to do with tempering, but in a spontaneous kind of a way. Whereas there's no angel measuring the 2 cups and pointlessly trying to divide the water equally. Here we have the water flowing from the base of this statue, and the water cascades, shaping itself according to the rocks. But then when the water flows from the source for a long time, what you really have is that the water leaves its mark in the rock. So there is this kind of tempering, a conversation between the earth and the water. The earth determines where the water will go, but then in turn the water will shape those parts. And then because it's called the source, we have to take the name into account, not just the imagery. You can also think of it as kind of going back to the beginning, going back to the origins, nourishing yourself. But it's a quiet force. It's a really beautiful card. So this is the demon card, and it illustrates a person wearing a mask. And I find this to be a really wonderful, I think this is where one of those instances where we see that even though he's illustrating a prehistoric world, he's making a deeply psychoanalytical point as well. So what does a mask do? Masks are featured, by the way, prominently in the minor arcana as well. So what does the mask do? The mask hides, but at the same time the mask reveals, because the mask allows us, wearing a mask allows us to express parts of ourselves that would otherwise be censored or suppressed. So you can see this as maybe liberating those impulses that the civilization asks us to suppress, to keep under lock and key. Right, so in that sense, this is a deeply psychological card. At the same time, it's not only that the mask hides and then by hiding liberates that which was previously imprisoned. The mask is also a ritual tool. So there's also that aspect of it. A ritual is something organized and structured. Religious almost. So instead of the tower, we have the standing rock. And this is possibly my favorite card in the entire deck. These standing rocks can be found, I think, all over the world, but certainly all over Europe. There's many of them in France, Spain, Portugal. They are prehistoric rocks kind of lifted by people, monolithic. We don't really know what purpose they served, and likely we'll never know. But what we see here is a person who erected the standing rock, climbing on top of it. And the reason why I like this card is because it illustrates, I think, a lot of the hubris of humans. So he did it because he can, right? His rock, he's the one who erected it, and there he is standing on top. And he must have an extraordinary view. If there are any enemies coming, he will see them first. But you know what? By climbing up so high, he's kind of condemned himself to death, because a human cannot survive this fall. It's almost impossible to come down. So yes, he sees a lot. He sees more than everyone else, but he can't really act. He's paralyzed. There's nothing to do. So there's a lot of insight, very little action. This is one of those things when you have a premature insight into something, and then you're powerless and terrified, and there's nothing that you can do, and you brought it all on yourself. So this is the star. It illustrates the discovery of fire, but to our ancestors from, I don't know, the Stone Age, this must have seemed like magic. It illustrates progress, because discovering fire was one of the major milestones in the development of our civilization. But at the same time, it must have seemed almost magical to them. And it also illustrates a spark. So on a literal level, if you want to interpret this card, you can say You know, there's a spark of inspiration, for example. This is the moon. So the sun and the moon, there's really not much to be said about these cards. They don't, I wouldn't say that they have any nuances that are very different than your standard moon and the sun. Except that here, he carries the sun on his back, and here the moon is in front of her. So you can say that the sun illuminates the path behind, whereas the moon kind of obscures, hides what's behind. That there's an association between the moon and the feminine and the sun and the masculine, but I don't think this is anything particularly new. They are beautiful cards. Her face is just amazing. Look at those cheekbones. Okay, so this is the judgment card. Well, it would be judgment card if this was any other deck. Here it's called the Prey. And it basically illustrates a rider. A rider. Did I just say that? A hunter, I wanted to say. I'm very hungry and I improvised this video, so pardon me if I'm talking nonsense. It shows this hunter aiming for his prey. But this is not just any hunt, because this is nearing the end of the cycle. It's kind of an initiation, as Barbara Moore points out in the guidebook. It's one of those moments where you finally prove yourself, and there is always a little bit of a risk. You have to be very precise or the animal will run away. So you need good timing, and you need precision, and you need certainty. And that is the moment when you kind of prove yourself and assume a certain role. It's ascension, in a sense. Only described not through an angel blowing a trumpet, but through this act of hunting and killing. Then there's the World card. And here we see someone with a hammer in their hand. They've just finished creating this circular structure that resembles Stonehenge, right? So they've created a cycle, and now they've stepped outside of it, ready to move on and create something else, something new. So it's the completion of a cycle, but then also the beginning of another cycle. And so that's the major arcana really quickly without going in depth. I hope this gives you an inkling as to why I like this deck so much. It's a really wonderful deck. It's one of those decks that you can't really just take out of the box and immediately start raiding with them. You really have to spend time with the imagery, looking at it very carefully. I like how I'm shuffling this, and even though I really have no question, I just want to show you what the cards look like on the table. So that's it. Thank you very much, and hopefully I did not bore you to death.